Hello and welcome. Tonight, before you drift into sleep, I want to take you somewhere quieter than you might expect. Not to a battlefield, not to a royal court, but to a small English village centuries ago on a Sunday afternoon, just after the church bells have stopped ringing. Imagine the air is cool, the ground slightly damp beneath worn leather shoes, and a group of villagers lingering outside the churchyard. Some want to play games, some want to dance, some simply don't want to go home to silence. But above them hangs an unspoken question: is it allowed? In Old England, boredom was not just a feeling. It was something people feared, judged, and sometimes even tried to control. Free time could be seen as dangerous. Idleness could be called a sin. And yet people still searched for small moments of laughter, music, conversation, and connection. Tonight we'll gently explore how they did that, how they filled the long hours before electricity, before television, before glowing screens, and what their struggle with boredom reveals about us. As you settle in, adjust your pillow, maybe dim the lights a little more, let your breathing slow, and before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Is it late where you are, or just the beginning of evening? I always love imagining this quiet circle of listeners spread across different cities and time zones, all sharing the same soft journey through history. Now let's step back in time together and listen to what silence once meant. There was a particular Sunday in early 17th century England when the air itself seemed uncertain, as though even the wind did not know whether it should move freely across the fields or wait for permission. The church bells had just fallen silent, their echoes dissolving into the damp countryside, and the villagers stood in loose clusters outside the stone walls, shifting their weight from one foot to another. The sermon had ended. The prayers had been spoken, and now came the question that lingered like mist over the hedgerows: what happens next? For generations, Sunday had been a day suspended between devotion and desire, between obedience and release. It was a day when bodies that had labored all week long suddenly found themselves with hours unclaimed, and unclaimed hours in that world were never innocent. In 1618, King James I issued a declaration that would come to be known as the Book of Sports, a royal statement outlining which recreational activities were considered lawful after divine service. It did not speak of wars or taxes or treaties. It spoke of dancing, archery, leaping, and certain traditional games. And in that quiet shift from matters of empire to matters of amusement, something revealing occurred. Leisure had entered the realm of politics. Imagine the scene as the declaration was read aloud from pulpits across England, its words unfolding slowly beneath vaulted ceilings that had long echoed only scripture and prayer. A royal text inked with authority now crossed the invisible threshold between crown and altar, entering sacred space with a weight that could not be ignored. The clergy who held the parchment did so with minds divided, and perhaps with hearts divided as well. Some regarded the measure with a quiet pragmatism, believing that modest recreation after worship might steady rather than weaken a community, allowing the body and spirit to move in rhythm instead of strain. They saw no contradiction in a measured joy that followed devotion, imagining that shared activity could knit neighbors closer together and release the tensions accumulated through labor and restraint. Others, however, sensed unease beneath the surface. To them, leisure granted too freely risked blurring the line between reverence and carelessness. They feared that what began as harmless play might over time loosen discipline and invite a subtle erosion of order. The Crown did not frame the declaration as indulgence nor as a surrender to whim. It spoke instead in the language of moderation, presenting recreation as something to be contained within a moral architecture. Permission was not universal, it was conditional. Only those who had first fulfilled their religious obligation were included within its allowance, while those who had not were deliberately excluded. In this distinction lay the true emphasis. Pleasure was acceptable, but only when anchored to obedience. Even as it opened a narrow gate toward enjoyment, the declaration constructed walls around it. Joy was acknowledged, but it was catalogued, defined, and circumscribed. The underlying principle was unmistakable. Time, especially communal time, could not be left to drift according to personal impulse. It would be arranged, observed, and subtly directed. In granting space for recreation, authority did not relinquish control. It refined it. To understand why such a document mattered, one must step into the deeper rhythm of early modern England. Life was not divided into entertainment and work as it often is now. Work bled into daylight, into seasons, into the very muscles of the body. The fields required tending, the animals required care, tools required repair, and the weather was both master and threat. There were no glowing screens to fracture attention, no constant hum of artificial light to extend the day. When labor paused, silence arrived fully, and silence could feel vast. In that stillness, people gathered. They sang ballads. They practiced archery, a skill still linked to national defense. They danced around maypoles during festive seasons. These were not trivial diversions, but communal rituals. Yet the same gatherings that offered warmth could also produce anxiety among authorities who had witnessed across Europe how quickly crowds could transform from celebratory to volatile. The fear was not of joy itself, but of what unstructured joy might become. Idleness had long carried theological weight. Within Christian teaching, sloth was counted among the deadly sins, not merely as laziness, but as spiritual neglect, a turning away from purpose. To be idle was to leave space for temptation, for gossip, for dissent. In small villages where rumor traveled faster than horse or cart conversation, could weave narratives that escaped control. When the king sanctioned certain recreations, he was not simply endorsing play. He was drawing a perimeter around acceptable forms of collective energy. He was in a subtle way acknowledging that boredom, or what we might now call the ache of unfilled hours, was powerful enough to require governance. The countryside after church on that imagined Sunday would not have erupted into chaos. It would have unfolded gradually. A fiddle might emerge from beneath a cloak. A group of young men might begin a game requiring speed and laughter. Children who had sat restlessly through scripture would dart toward open space with the sudden urgency of birds released from a cage. Older villagers might stand at the edges, half approving, half cautious, remembering times when such gatherings had drawn disapproval from stricter ministers. Overhead clouds would drift without concern for edicts or sermons. Yet beneath this pastoral calm lay a negotiation centuries in the making. Who owns the hours when work stops? It is tempting to imagine the past as either endlessly busy or endlessly dull, but the truth lies in the tension between the two. The agricultural calendar contained intense bursts of labor and quieter stretches when fields lay fallow. Winter evenings were long darkness, arriving early and departing late. In such stretches, the human mind had to find occupation. Stories were told by firelight. Psalms were sung softly. Hands repaired tools that did not yet need repair, simply to feel useful. Boredom, though unnamed as we name it, now existed as a sensation of restlessness, of time, expanding beyond comfort. The Book of Sports did not create that sensation. It responded to it. It was an official recognition that people would seek movement when stillness pressed too heavily against them. The controversy surrounding the declaration intensified when Charles I reissued it in 1633 and required clergy to read it publicly. Some refused. For them, the document symbolized royal interference in moral life. For others, refusal itself was disobedience to lawful authority. Thus, a question about dancing after church evolved into a dispute about power. In that evolution lies the heart of the story. Boredom and leisure are never merely personal experiences. They intersect with hierarchy doctrine and governance. A village game becomes a site of ideological struggle. A maypole becomes a symbol of either communal vitality or moral laxity, depending on who is watching. Picture a minister standing before his congregation, the parchment trembling slightly in his hand, not from weakness, but from the awareness that words once spoken cannot be drawn back into silence. The light filtering through narrow windows falls across the page, illuminating ink that carries more than instruction. It carries alignment. He knows that whatever he reads will place him quietly, but unmistakably on one side of an invisible divide. The congregation watches some with curiosity, some with caution, others with an expression carefully composed so as not to reveal too much. The air feels dense, as though even breath must wait for the sentence to conclude before it can move freely again. Outside, young men lean against the stone wall, boots pressing into the earth that has known their labor all week. Their hands are rough, their shoulders heavy with habit, their faces marked not by rebellion, but by fatigue. They are not revolutionaries. They do not gather with banners or slogans. They are simply tired from labor and hungry for lightness, hungry for movement that is not dictated by duty. Their anticipation is quiet, but it is shared. And when many bodies share the same anticipation, it acquires weight. It becomes something almost tangible, a collective pause suspended between restraint and release. Authorities understood this instinctively. They did not need open defiance to recognize potential tension. They sensed it in silence, in the subtle shifting of feet, in the way a crowd lingers instead of dispersing. A people deprived entirely of recreation might grow resentful, their frustration folding inward until it hardens. A people given too much freedom might grow unruly, their energy spilling beyond intention. Between these two outcomes lay a narrow path. The solution in the royal mind was calibrated permission, an allowance measured with care, designed to relieve pressure without dissolving control, to offer movement without surrendering direction. There is something almost mythic about this balance, as though the nation stood between two ancient spirits, order and release, each demanding allegiance. The church bells, when they rang, called bodies into disciplined formation. The fiddle, when it sounded, invited them to loosen. Between bell and fiddle stretched the fragile fabric of social peace. The Book of Sports attempted to stitch that fabric more tightly to ensure that neither thread would snap. It allowed archery, which strengthened defense and required skill. It permitted certain dances rooted in tradition. It did not endorse reckless indulgence. Even leisure was to serve a purpose. And yet no decree can fully contain the human response to time. The villagers who scattered across fields after service would carry with them private thoughts. Some would feel relief, grateful for sanctioned joy. Others would feel suspicion, wondering whether pleasure granted by authority remained pleasure at all. A few might feel guilt, the old teachings about sloth whispering in their minds. In this mixture of emotions, we glimpse the complexity of early modern life. Boredom was not a word spoken in those churchyards, but the impulse to escape monotony, to animate the hours, was very much alive. As dusk approached and the game slowed, the village would gradually return to stillness. Doors would close, candles would be lit. The earlier laughter would soften into memory. And somewhere, perhaps in a manor house or a study lined with books, discussions would continue about the wisdom of permitting such scenes. Was the crown too lenient? Were the ministers too rigid? The argument would not end quickly. It would simmer, resurface, and intertwine with broader conflicts that eventually reshape the nation. But on that single Sunday evening, what remained most tangible was the simple human desire to feel the pulse of community in otherwise quiet lives. If we listen closely across the centuries, we can almost hear it, the rustle of woolen garments, the thud of feet against packed earth, the distant echo of a psalm giving way to laughter. It is easy to dismiss these sounds as minor notes in the grand symphony of history, yet they reveal something essential. When work paused and the sky stretched wide above them, the people of Old England did not merely wait for time to pass. They stepped into it cautiously aware that even joy could be scrutinized. In doing so, they taught us that boredom is never simply emptiness. It is a space in which authority, faith, and human longing quietly meet and sometimes collide beneath the slow turning of a Sunday sky. Long before the word boredom settled into the English language, before it found a place in dictionaries or novels, there was another word that carried far greater weight: idleness. It did not describe a passing feeling. It described a condition of the soul. In Old England, to be idle was not simply to have nothing to do. It was to stand too close to danger. It was to drift from purpose. It was to open a door through which temptation might quietly enter. If you walked through a village in the late medieval or early modern period and asked what troubled people most about empty hours, they might not speak of restlessness or mental fatigue. They might speak instead of sloth, of wasted time, of the subtle corrosion that began when hands were still and minds were left unattended. The teaching was familiar and repeated often. Sloth was counted among the 7 deadly sins, but it was not merely laziness in the modern sense. It was spiritual neglect, a dulling of the will to do what one ought to do. In sermons delivered from wooden pulpits and beneath stone arches, ministers reminded congregations that time itself was a gift entrusted to them. To misuse it was to show ingratitude. Every hour had weight. Every hour would be accounted for. In such a world, the idea of sitting without purpose was not neutral. It carried suspicion. An idle body might invite idle thoughts, and idle thoughts might wander where they should not. This moral framework shaped the rhythm of daily life in ways that were rarely dramatic, but always persistent. A farmer who rose before dawn did not rise merely because the fields demanded it, though they did. He rose because diligence was virtue made visible. A woman who mended clothing by candlelight after the day's work had ended did not always do so out of necessity alone. She did so because usefulness was a shield against accusation. Even children learned early that stillness must be justified. To sit quietly could be interpreted as obedience, but to linger aimlessly invited correction. Movement, effort, visible, occupation. These were signs that one remained aligned with expectation. And yet beneath this steady insistence on activity, human nature moved in quieter currents. There were moments when the fields were sown and little could be done but wait. There were winter afternoons when daylight thinned early and darkness pressed against the windows long before supper. In such stretches, the moral language of idleness did not erase the reality of time unfolding slowly. It only layered that reality with tension. One might feel the heaviness of an unstructured hour and immediately search for anything that could convert it into legitimacy. A tool might be sharpened again, though it had been sharpened the week before. A story might be retold, embroidered slightly with new detail. A psalm might be sung not out of sudden inspiration, but because song filled space that might otherwise feel too wide. It is easy to mistake this for a society that had no concept of leisure, but that would be misleading. There were feast days, fairs, and communal celebrations. There were sanctioned intervals of joy. The difference lay in framing. Leisure was rarely defended as leisure. It was justified as tradition, as fellowship, as health, as reinforcement of bonds. It was folded into a narrative of purpose. What could not be justified in such terms risked being labeled idle. The boundary was subtle and constantly negotiated, often without formal acknowledgement. The language of idleness also carried economic undertones. In a world where survival depended upon collective effort, a person perceived as habitually unproductive threatened more than moral order. He threatened material stability. To work was not simply virtuous, it was necessary. A neighbor who lingered too often at the edge of the field, who avoided shared labor, who appeared disengaged, drew quiet scrutiny. Communities were small enough that patterns did not go unnoticed. Reputation formed slowly but solidified quickly. To be called idle was to be placed at the periphery of trust. Yet idleness could not be eliminated entirely, for it was tied to the very structure of existence. Crops required waiting. Weather imposed pauses. Illness confined bodies to beds. Even the most disciplined soul encountered hours that resisted direction. It was within these hours that imagination stirred. People reflected, worried, hoped. They replayed conversations. They wondered about distant towns or distant futures. The mind, unoccupied by immediate tasks, roamed. And it was precisely this roaming that troubled moral teachers. A mind allowed to wander might question authority, might doubt doctrine, might dwell too long on dissatisfaction. Thus, sermons often addressed not only visible inactivity, but inward disposition, pressing beyond what the eye could observe into what the conscience might conceal. It was not enough that hands were busy. The heart, too, was expected to remain aligned with duty. To be idle in heart, to neglect one's calling, to resent one's station, these were spoken of with a seriousness equal to that reserved for neglected chores or unfinished labor. A person might fulfill outward responsibilities and still be cautioned against a drifting spirit, against a reluctance that settled quietly beneath obedience. The emphasis was clear. Virtue was not measured solely by movement, but by intention. Diligence had to be sincere, not merely performed. The vigilance extended beyond the body and into the interior landscape of thought. Ministers reminded their congregations that thoughts themselves carried weight, that inward resistance or dissatisfaction could erode discipline as surely as outward laziness. In this moral climate, idleness was not confined to still hands or paused footsteps. It became a matter of attention, of focus, of willingness. Even moments of reflection required careful framing, lest they slip into brooding or distraction. A mind allowed to wander too freely risked stepping outside the bounds of its assigned purpose. In this way, the concept of idleness grew expansive, almost atmospheric. It did not reside in a single act or omission. It surrounded daily life, subtle yet persistent. It hovered like an unseen standard against which actions, motivations, and even fleeting impulses were measured. People learned to examine themselves not only for what they had done, but for how earnestly they had done it. Under such scrutiny, time was never entirely neutral. It was always being weighed, always being interpreted as though every hour carried with it a quiet expectation that it justify its own existence. Consider again the young men who waited outside church walls on Sunday afternoons. Their desire for recreation did not automatically make them sinful, yet the moral vocabulary surrounding them ensured that their desire would be interpreted through a lens of caution. If they played too long, laughter echoing into dusk, someone might remark that such noise bordered on excess. If they lingered without visible occupation, suspicion might follow. They learned often instinctively to clothe enjoyment in acceptability. They called it exercise. They called it practice. They called it community. Within households, the pattern repeated in quieter forms. A wife who paused in her spinning might feel a flicker of unease, not because she was lazy, but because pause itself had been moralized. A craftsman who sat by the fire after sunset might recount the day's tasks aloud, as if to reassure himself that he had earned rest. Rest was permissible. Idleness was not. The distinction lay not always in action, but in interpretation. Rest followed labor. Idleness preceded it. Over time, this moral vigilance shaped identity. To be English in certain narratives was to be industrious, steady, purposeful. National character entwined with work ethic. Even as political and religious conflicts shifted across decades, the suspicion of idle time endured. It was embedded in language, in proverbs, in everyday admonitions. Time was a field to be cultivated, not a landscape to wander without aim. Yet the human longing for unstructured space did not vanish under scrutiny. It surfaced in storytelling traditions that unfolded slowly by hearthlight. It appeared in the careful carving of small decorative objects whose creation exceeded necessity. It emerged in the pleasure of listening rather than speaking, in the habit of watching clouds drift beyond cottage windows. These moments did not always announce themselves as rebellion. They were softer than that. They were acknowledgments that the spirit required more than relentless utility. The tension between moral expectation and inward experience created a subtle drama that rarely erupted into spectacle, but shaped consciousness nonetheless. A person might kneel in prayer and genuinely seek alignment, yet still feel a restlessness that prayer did not immediately dissolve. That restlessness was not yet called boredom. It was a quiet ache, a sense that time stretched wider than intention. To live within such a framework required continual adjustment. One learned to translate feeling into acceptable action, to redirect wandering thought into sanctioned activity. This moral architecture also meant that any official statement about recreation, such as the declaration permitting certain Sunday activities, carried deeper resonance. It did not merely authorize play, it interacted with centuries of teaching about the dangers of idleness. When the Crown allowed specified recreations after worship, it implicitly distinguished between legitimate leisure and sinful stagnation. The allowance reassured some that structured enjoyment did not betray faith. It unsettled others who feared that any relaxation of vigilance would erode discipline. As evening settled over fields and villages, and as candles flickered in narrow windows, individuals lay in bed reviewing the day. Had they worked enough? Had they prayed sincerely? Had they wasted any hour? Such questions were not always conscious. Yet they moved beneath the surface of thought. Sleep arrived not simply as physical necessity, but as temporary release from evaluation. Morning would bring new tasks, new opportunities to demonstrate usefulness. In this environment, idleness functioned almost like an unseen character in daily life, present without form, yet felt with unmistakable clarity. It did not enter rooms with sound, nor did it announce itself with spectacle, but it lingered in pauses, in unfinished gestures, in the quiet spaces between tasks. It was invoked in warnings spoken gently to children and more sternly to adults, implied in glances exchanged, when someone lingered too long without purpose, embedded in expectation so thoroughly that it required no formal definition. People did not always speak its name, yet they sensed its proximity. It was less an act than a possibility, less a deed than a threshold, always waiting at the edge of awareness, ready to be crossed without intention. Because it was framed as morally charged idleness, did more than regulate behavior. It shaped identity. Individuals learned to measure themselves against its shadow. To be active was not merely to complete work, but to demonstrate character. To resist idleness was to affirm one's worth, to reassure oneself and others that one remained aligned with duty and discipline. Effort became a language through which value was expressed. Conversely, to succumb to idleness was not simply to rest too long. It was to risk diminishment, to invite doubt about one's resolve or reliability. Even the suggestion of idleness could unsettle a reputation. In this subtle but persistent way, the concept did not merely influence daily habits. It helped define how people saw themselves within the moral landscape they inhabited. The irony, perhaps, is that the very insistence on constant purpose heightened sensitivity to empty moments. When time was treated as sacred currency, any perceived waste felt costly. The mind trained to guard against sloth became alert to its own pauses. In guarding against idleness, people became acutely aware of it. The boundary they drew gave the concept sharper outline. As the centuries edged toward modernity, this long tradition of moralizing time would not disappear. It would evolve, mingle with economic change and urban growth. But at this stage in villages and towns where church bells regulated the week and sermons shaped conscience, idleness stood as both warning and shadow. It was the absence against which effort was defined. It was the silence into which caution spoke. And though no one yet named the feeling that crept in during prolonged stillness, the groundwork had been laid. The moral crime of idleness would one day transform into a psychological discomfort with empty time. For now, however, it remained what it had long been, a quiet but powerful reminder that every hour carried judgment, and that to fill it wisely was not only practical but righteous. If idleness hovered like an unseen standard over daily life, then village recreation was the quiet counterweight that kept that standard from hardening into suffocation. It did not arrive with fanfare. It did not declare itself as rebellion. It unfolded gradually in the space between obligation and dusk, in the hush after tools were set aside and before doors were latched for the night. In the English countryside, recreation was rarely described as escape. It was rhythm. It was the pulse that returned to the body once the strain of labor eased, a reminder that human beings were more than their tasks. Picture a late afternoon in early autumn. The harvest has been gathered, or at least most of it, and the urgency that marked the previous weeks has softened. The fields, though not silent, no longer demand the same intensity of attention. A small clearing near the village center begins to fill. No proclamation summons the people. No bell commands their presence. They come because the air feels different, because work has loosened its grip, because others are already gathering. Children drift first, instinctively drawn to movement. Then the young men and women, their posture shifting as they step out of domestic spaces into open ground. Older villagers follow, more slowly, settling at the periphery where observation blends with participation. What occurs next may seem simple: a game, a dance, a contest of skill. Yet beneath the visible motion lies a complex exchange. Recreation in the village was never merely about passing time. It reaffirmed belonging. It clarified roles. It allowed grievances to dissolve through laughter or competition. When two men squared off in a friendly contest of strength or speed, they were not only testing themselves, they were negotiating status within a framework that permitted challenge without rupture. When women joined hands in patterned movement, circling beneath the fading light, they reinforced bonds that would sustain them through the quieter, heavier hours of winter. These activities were not invented to cure boredom in the modern sense. They were woven into the fabric of communal existence. The village did not divide life neatly into work and entertainment. Instead, it moved through cycles of intensity and release. Recreation marked transition. It signaled that labor had been acknowledged and that rest in measured form could follow. In this way, recreation served as a social agreement: we have worked, now we may gather. We have endured, now we may exhale. There was also something deeply practical about such gatherings. In a world where communication traveled no faster than foot, or horse-shared space was the primary medium through which news spread, stories of distant towns, of marriages arranged, of minor disputes settled or simmering. These circulated most easily when people stood close enough to read each other's expressions. A dance might end, but conversation continued. A game might pause, but alliances shifted subtly at its edges. Recreation allowed information to move without formal announcement. Even the physicality of village games held meaning. Many activities required coordination, awareness of terrain, and responsiveness to others. They strengthened bodies that would soon return to labor, but they also strengthened attentiveness. To play well was to read the mood of the group, to anticipate movement, to sense when laughter was tipping toward mockery, and to redirect it. Such instincts maintained harmony. Recreation was not chaos. It was rehearsed interaction governed by unwritten codes. And yet, as gentle as these scenes appear from a distance, they were not free from tension. The moral suspicion surrounding idleness lingered, as did the awareness that too much exuberance might attract criticism. Participants learned to calibrate their energy. They avoided pushing festivities beyond what seemed appropriate for the hour or season. When twilight deepened, gatherings often dissolved without command. The rhythm of the village asserted itself again, drawing people back toward hearth and household. In this ebb and flow lay the true structure of recreation expansion, followed by return. There were moments, of course, when seasonal celebrations amplified this pattern. On feast days or during traditional festivals, the scale widened. Decorations appeared. Music carried farther across fields. The boundary between sacred and secular blurred, though not entirely. Even then, ritual framed expression. Songs might recount familiar tales. Dances followed patterns passed down through generations. Innovation existed, but it was subtle, layered atop continuity rather than replacing it. The village did not seek novelty for its own sake. It sought renewal of what was already known. To understand how such recreation countered the weight of idleness, one must attend to the sensory texture of these hours. The scent of earth cooling after a warm day, the uneven ground beneath boots, the rhythm of clapping hands marking time. These sensations anchored people in the present. Where idle moments might invite uneasy introspection, communal play redirected attention outward. The mind, instead of circling private worries, synchronized with shared motion. Boredom, though unnamed, was absorbed into collective rhythm. There is a quiet wisdom in this design. When time feels heavy, movement lightens it. When silence grows oppressive, song disperses it. Village recreation did not deny the moral framework that surrounded it. It operated within it. By gathering visibly and participating in recognized activities, villagers transformed potential idleness into visible engagement. Their joy was not hidden. It was enacted openly, which in turn shielded it from accusations of secrecy or indulgence. One might imagine an elderly villager watching from a bench near the churchyard, hands folded loosely, eyes attentive. He has seen these gatherings across decades. He remembers seasons when poor harvests dampened spirits and fewer people appeared. He recalls years when laughter rang louder, when prosperity lent ease to movement. Through such recollection, he understands what younger participants feel instinctively. Recreation is less about novelty than about continuity. It reassures the village that it still exists as a unit, that shared patterns persist, even as individuals age and pass away. In the absence of such rhythm, something intangible would fray. Without moments of sanctioned release, the discipline of daily labor might harden into resentment. Without opportunities for visible fellowship, suspicion might grow unchecked. Recreation functioned as maintenance not only of morale, but of cohesion. It allowed grievances to surface lightly through jest or competition, rather than calcify into hostility. A teasing remark during a game might release tension that otherwise lingered in silence. As the sun lowered and shadows lengthened across the uneven ground, the tempo of activity often slowed without instruction or signal. The change was subtle at first, a missed beat in the clapping a laugh that lingered a moment longer before fading footsteps that no longer pressed urgently into the earth. No authority needed to intervene, no voice to call the gathering to a close. The rhythm dissolved of its own accord, guided by something instinctive and shared. Fatigue, both physical and social, moved gently through the group, softening gestures and quieting voices. The same bodies that had leaned eagerly into motion began to lean instead toward home. People drifted away in pairs or small clusters, not abruptly, but gradually, as though drawn by an invisible thread, back toward hearth and habit. Conversation tapered naturally, shifting from animated exchange to softer remarks, then to pauses that felt neither awkward nor empty. The path back to cottages was familiar, worn by repetition, and in that familiarity there was reassurance. Doors opened light from within, spilling briefly onto darkening thresholds before closing again. The earlier liveliness did not vanish. It settled, transforming rather than disappearing. Inside, the air felt different, warmer, closer edged with the scent of wood smoke or supper long since finished. The body having moved freely and fully welcomed stillness with a kind of gratitude. Muscles relaxed without resistance. Breathing deepened. The quiet no longer pressed as it might have earlier in the day. Idleness, which might have felt threatening when time first stretched wide and unclaimed, now felt earned. It was no longer vacancy, but completion. It carried the weight of participation, the residue of shared movement. Rest replaced unease, and the evening unfolded not as an empty expanse, but as a gentle closing of the day's rhythm. This distinction is subtle, but profound. Recreation did not eliminate idle time. It transformed its meaning. After shared exertion, stillness carried satisfaction instead of unease. The moral charge surrounding inactivity diminished because it followed visible engagement. Thus, village recreation created a buffer between obligation and solitude. It mediated the transition from collective labor to private reflection. Not every villager experienced these moments in identical ways. Personal temperaments varied. Some thrived in the center of activity, voices raised, gestures broad. Others preferred the edges, participating quietly, contributing through presence rather than display. The structure accommodated both. There was space for exuberance and space for reserve. In this flexibility lay resilience. Recreation did not demand uniform expression. It invited participation in degrees. As seasons turned and years accumulated, these gatherings etched themselves into memory. A particular dance beneath an especially bright sky. A contest remembered long after the players had grown older. Such recollections formed part of the village's internal narrative. They were retold during winter evenings, reinforcing identity. In remembering shared joy, villagers reaffirmed connection across time. The broader moral discourse about idleness did not vanish in the presence of recreation. Rather, it coexisted with it, creating a dynamic equilibrium. Sermons might warn against excess, yet ministers themselves often understood the necessity of measured fellowship. The village, in its lived practice, navigated between caution and vitality without formal blueprint. Its rhythm emerged organically, shaped by necessity, belief, and human inclination. If one listens carefully beyond the visible gestures and the surface of laughter, one begins to sense something subtler moving beneath it all, a quiet negotiation between individual and community, almost imperceptible yet constant. It does not announce itself in words, nor does it demand attention, but it unfolds in the small adjustments people make to one another. To join a game is to accept, even if only for a short while, the boundaries set by others. It is to agree that movement will follow certain expectations, that victory and defeat will be defined collectively rather than privately. There is humility in that agreement, a willingness to place personal impulse within a shared structure. To dance in a circle is even more revealing. One's steps must respond to the steps beside them. The rhythm is not self-created. It is received and maintained through mutual awareness. A misstep affects more than the one who falters. Alignment becomes instinctive, and with it comes a sense of cohesion that cannot be achieved alone. These acts, though light in appearance and often fleeting, carry deeper significance. They are rehearsals in belonging, subtle affirmations that individuality does not require isolation. In participating, people momentarily dissolve the sharp edges of separateness. They are not solitary figures attempting to conquer long, empty hours through distraction. Instead, they move within a shared cadence, their presence woven into something continuous and recognizable. The pattern does not erase them. It holds them, and in being held even briefly, they are reminded that time need not be endured in solitude. It can be shaped, collectively softened by proximity, steadied by the simple act of moving together. And so, as night settled and stars appeared faintly above the darkened fields, the village rested not only from labor, but from isolation. The rhythm of recreation had steadied it. Idleness remained a moral concept, hovering in sermons and glances, but within the cadence of communal life, it lost some of its sharpness. Time had been shaped not by decree this time, but by habit and shared desire. The clearing near the church would stand empty until the next gathering grass, bearing faint traces of footprints, as though the earth itself remembered the movement. In that memory lay the quiet assurance that when labor paused again, the rhythm would return, and with it, the gentle protection against the weight of unfilled hours. There is a particular stillness that falls over a community when joy becomes something to be watched. It is not the stillness of exhaustion nor the calm that follows shared laughter. It is subtler than that. It settles like a thin layer of frost over ordinary gestures, making people slightly more careful, slightly more aware that someone somewhere may be measuring what once felt spontaneous. In Old England, leisure did not simply grow from the soil of village life and remain untouched. It was observed, it was discussed. It was at times questioned and shaped by forces that stood beyond the field and beyond the churchyard. The regulation of leisure did not always arrive in the form of sudden prohibition. Often it began as concern that gatherings might extend too long into evening, concern that certain festivities blurred the boundary between celebration and excess, concern that the energy released in dance or contest could, if unchecked, tip into something harder to contain. Those who voiced such concerns did not always oppose joy itself. Many believed deeply in communal harmony. Yet harmony in their understanding required structure. Unstructured time, especially shared unstructured time, carried unpredictable currents. Picture a village green during a season of festivity. Decorations hang lightly from branches. A makeshift stage stands near the edge of open ground. Music rises, familiar and patterned. Now imagine that beyond the visible circle of activity, conversations unfold elsewhere, within parish houses, within quiet studies, within halls where decisions are weighed. Questions circulate. How late should such gatherings continue? Who oversees them? What activities remain within acceptable bounds? None of these questions immediately silence the music. Instead, they hover, shaping perception. Regulation often worked not through abrupt command, but through expectation. And expectation has a way of shaping behavior more quietly and more persistently than decree. There was no need for raised voices or sudden prohibitions. Instead, guidance entered conversation in tones that seemed reasonable, even protective. A minister might remind congregants that joy is best when modest, spoken not as rebuke, but as counsel framed as care for the soul rather than suspicion of the body. A local authority might emphasize that recreation should not interfere with obligations, suggesting that pleasure must remain secondary to duty, that it should follow labor rather than compete with it. The words are measured, even gentle, yet they introduce a line that participants learn to see without it being drawn visibly on the ground. Over time, that line becomes part of the landscape. It does not need to be pointed out repeatedly. It is sensed. Leisure becomes something performed with awareness, an activity carried out under an invisible canopy of understanding. Movements remain light. Laughter still rises. Games continue. But beneath the ease lies a subtle consciousness that this ease exists within consent. Participants feel the boundary without being told at every moment where it lies. They instinctively adjust, stopping just short of excess lowering voices before they carry too far, ending gatherings before they stretch too long. Lightness is preserved, but it is no longer entirely spontaneous. It is shaped by the knowledge that lightness is permitted, not assumed. There were times, of course, when regulation took clearer form. Statements were issued. Guidelines were articulated. Specific activities were named as appropriate or inappropriate. Yet even in these moments, the aim was often balance rather than eradication. The intent was to prevent disorder without extinguishing vitality. Leisure was not declared inherently wrong. It was framed as powerful and therefore in need of direction. Authority did not deny the human impulse to gather. It sought to guide it. This guidance reflected a broader anxiety about collective energy, a single individual at rest posed little threat. 100 individuals moving in unison, laughing, responding to shared rhythm, this was different. It was not inherently rebellious, yet it demonstrated the capacity for unity beyond formal hierarchy. Regulation, then, was as much about visibility as morality. When people gathered openly, their presence asserted a kind of strength. Even benign strength could unsettle those tasked with maintaining order. And so leisure developed an additional layer, self-awareness, subtle yet constant, like a thin veil drawn gently across what had once felt entirely open. Participants no longer moved solely according to impulse. They moved with a quiet consciousness of how their actions might appear. The possibility of being observed by clergy, by neighbors, by those who carried authority, did not always manifest in direct interference, but it lingered as a silent presence. Over time, that presence settled inward. People began to internalize the gaze that might be turned upon them, and in doing so, they became both performers and guardians of their own conduct. They calibrated not only duration and volume, but tone. It was not enough to end a gathering at a reasonable hour. The mood itself required balance. Laughter remained, but it did not tip into mockery. Competition persisted, but it did not escalate into hostility. Festivities retained their warmth, yet edges softened before they could sharpen. There was an attentiveness in the way people responded to one another, a sensitivity to the moment when amusement approached excess. If a jest grew too pointed, someone would redirect it often with a lighter remark that dissolved tension without confrontation. If enthusiasm swelled too high, fatigue or prudence would gently temper it, not as suppression, but as adjustment. In this way, regulation seeped into habit. What began as external guidance gradually became instinct. The need for visible oversight diminished because communities learned to regulate themselves. Leisure continued, but it carried within it a shared understanding of proportion. It became less about external enforcement and more about collective restraint, a quiet agreement that joy could flourish best when it remained aware of its own boundaries. Consider again the Sunday afternoon after worship had concluded. Permission for certain recreations might exist, yet the permission carried conditions. Those who attended service first could participate. Those who did not were excluded. Even within allowance lay division. Attendance signaled compliance. Recreation followed as acknowledgement. The structure communicated something precise. Joy was safest when tethered to obedience. The sequence mattered. This sequencing influenced how leisure felt. It was no longer merely the release that followed labor. It was the extension of a sanctioned order. Participants stepped into games and dances with awareness that these acts had been framed, bounded, and justified. For some, this framing offered reassurance. It clarified that pleasure need not conflict with faith. For others, it introduced subtle tension, a sense that spontaneity had been filtered through approval. Yet regulation did not eliminate creativity. On the contrary, it often encouraged adaptation. When certain forms of expression were discouraged, others emerged that achieved similar ends without crossing explicit lines. A gathering might shift location. A game might alter its rules slightly. A song might soften particular verses. The spirit of recreation persisted, flexible enough to move around obstacles without confronting them directly. This flexibility became part of communal intelligence. The act of regulating leisure also revealed something about authorities' understanding of time. Time was not viewed as neutral terrain. It was charged with potential. An idle hour might foster reflection or resentment. A shared hour might build cohesion or challenge hierarchy. By shaping how hours were spent, Authorities believed they were shaping outcomes. Leisure was thus treated as a resource to be managed, much like land or labor. Within households, this broader regulation echoed in quieter forms. Parents monitored children's play not to extinguish it, but to ensure it remained within propriety. Elders offered reminders about moderation. These small gestures mirrored larger patterns. They reinforced the idea that joy required balance, that freedom functioned best when circumscribed by mutual understanding. Over time, the presence of regulation became almost invisible, settling so thoroughly into the fabric of daily life that it no longer felt like an external force. It did not require constant enforcement, nor did it depend on visible authority standing watch. Instead, it diffused into custom. People absorbed it gradually until guidance and instinct began to overlap. What had once been articulated in reminders or declarations transformed into something quieter, more enduring. It no longer announced itself. It simply existed. It lived in memory carried forward through stories of past excesses, gently retold as cautionary tales. These stories did not need to be dramatic to be effective. Their power lay in repetition, in the subtle implication that boundaries had been tested before and that lessons had been learned. Each retelling reinforced an unspoken understanding. The past became a guide, shaping present behavior without the need for renewed instruction. It lived in the instinct to conclude festivities before darkness deepened too far in the natural slowing of movement, as evening advanced in the shared sense that a certain point had been reached. No signal needed to be given. The transition unfolded smoothly, almost automatically, and it lived in the shared agreement that certain spaces, certain days, certain sequences carried significance. People recognized these patterns without needing them explained. In this way, regulation ceased to feel imposed. It became woven into expectation itself, steady and unobtrusive, guiding conduct without appearing to do so. And yet, even within this web of guidance, the core human impulse remained unchanged. People continued to seek movement, laughter, and companionship. Regulation shaped expression, but did not extinguish desire. In fact, one might argue that awareness intensified appreciation. When joy was measured, it was also cherished. When leisure required mindfulness, participants savored it more deliberately. As evening settled after a regulated gathering, the dispersal carried an added note of completion. Participants felt not only physically satisfied, but morally aligned. They had enjoyed themselves within the bounds set before them. They had neither transgressed nor withdrawn. The balance had held. The village returned to quiet not because joy had been suppressed, but because it had been guided to its natural close. There is a quiet paradox in this history. Regulation intended to contain potential disorder also reinforced communal rhythm. By articulating boundaries, it clarified expectations. By permitting specific forms of recreation, it validated them. Leisure became less ambiguous, less vulnerable to accusation. In being named and structured, it gained legitimacy. And yet beneath this surface equilibrium, the tension between authority and spontaneity never fully dissolved. It lingered in the background, subtle but persistent. Every gathering carried within it the memory that it existed within a framework. Every laugh echoed faintly against that awareness. This tension did not dominate experience. It simply accompanied it. As stars emerged and the last figures disappeared into their cottages, the village settled once more into darkness. Somewhere beyond its edges, discussions about order and propriety continued in distant chambers. But within the village itself, the lived reality of leisure remained grounded in shared understanding. Regulation had shaped it, yes, but so had habit necessity and human longing. Time once again had been negotiated. It had not been left entirely free, nor had it been locked away. It had moved through channels carved by belief and caution. And in that movement lay the delicate balance that defined Old England's relationship with leisure, not suppression, not abandon, but measured allowance sustained by the quiet awareness that even joy carried consequence. There were places in Old England where the air felt different the moment one stepped across the threshold. Not louder, not necessarily brighter, but charged with a kind of shared warmth that did not exist in open fields or within church walls. The tavern stood at the edge of the village road or along the narrower lanes of growing towns, neither entirely private nor wholly public. Its door opened and closed throughout the day, but toward evening it seemed to draw people in with quiet insistence. Here leisure gathered under a roof. The tavern was not merely a structure of wood and stone. It was an arrangement of proximity. Benches placed close enough that shoulders brushed. Tables worn smooth by hands that rested, gestured, tapped in emphasis. Light that flickered and pooled in corners, softening the edges of faces. Voices overlapping without fully drowning one another. The rhythm inside differed from the rhythm outside. It was denser layered, sustained by presence. Those who entered were rarely strangers to one another. Farmers, craftsmen, laborers, travelers passing through each brought with them fragments of the day. In the fields, speech had been sparse, shaped by necessity. At home, conversation had followed domestic patterns. In the tavern, speech expanded. It bent and looped. It circled back on itself. It tested opinion gently and sometimes less gently. Here, time did not stretch as it did in solitary quiet. It folded inward, thickened by exchange. To call the tavern a place of escape would be too simple. It was not an abandonment of obligation. Many who sat at those tables would return at dawn to work no less demanding than before. Instead, the tavern functioned as a chamber where the weight of daily vigilance loosened slightly. The moral suspicion of idleness did not vanish entirely, but it shifted. Conversation, after all, was not inactivity. It was engagement of another kind. Words became labor of a social sort. There is something revealing about the way bodies position themselves in such spaces. Men leaned forward when a story grew compelling. Hands traced shapes in the air when recounting events. Laughter rose and fell in waves, sometimes erupting unexpectedly, sometimes simmering in low murmurs. No one needed to instruct the gathering to form. It formed because human beings, after hours of disciplined effort, required recognition from those who understood the same rhythms of toil. Within these walls, the hierarchy of the village softened, but did not disappear. Differences of age and reputation remained visible, yet they were negotiated through interaction, rather than enforced by formal decree. A younger man might challenge an older one's recollection with a grin rather than a bow. A disagreement might spark heat, then cool through shared humor. The tavern allowed friction to surface in controlled form. It provided a space where tension could release through speech rather than silence. Authorities were not blind to this. The tavern's energy was both valued and watched. It fostered fellowship, yes, but fellowship carried potential. When many voices converged, they shaped narratives. Stories of hardship, of dissatisfaction, of distant events, these circulated freely. The tavern amplified them. What might have remained a private frustration at home became collective commentary when spoken aloud among peers. And yet the same mechanism that could intensify unrest also diffused it. To speak a grievance is sometimes to reduce its sharpness. To hear others echo similar struggles can transform isolation into solidarity rather than resentment. In this sense, the tavern acted as a balancing chamber within the broader system of regulated leisure, absorbing and redistributing the energies that elsewhere might have pressed too heavily against silence. It did not replace the village green, nor did it compete with it. Instead, it offered a different texture of gathering, where the village green presented visible open-air recreation movement beneath sky gestures framed by daylight. The tavern provided enclosed conversation, a more contained and concentrated exchange that unfolded within walls and under a lower ceiling. The shift in setting altered the mode of engagement without diminishing its importance. Where dance synchronized bodies guiding steps into shared rhythm and aligning motion through patterned repetition, discussion synchronized thought. Voices moved in turn, intersecting and diverging, finding cadence in dialogue rather than choreography. The harmony here was not measured in footwork, but in understanding in the subtle adjustments made as one speaker responded to another. In both spaces, individuals aligned themselves with a collective current. One alignment was physical, the other intellectual, yet both served a similar purpose. The two were not opposites, but complements, distinct expressions of the same underlying need. One offered outward vitality, the other offered inward articulation. One dispersed energy across open ground, the other concentrated it around a table. Together, they prevented idle hours from collapsing inward into isolation or unease. They redirected mental restlessness outward into shared expression, transforming what might have become private stagnation into communal movement, whether through step or speech. Consider the cadence of a typical evening. A door opens, cool air briefly entering, with a figure silhouetted against fading light. A nod, a murmur of greeting. Space is made at the table. News is exchanged, small at first, then more layered. Someone recounts an incident from the market. Another comments on the weather's stubbornness. Gradually, the topics deepen. Opinions form and reform in the air. The room hums not with chaos, but with circulation. There is an art to such circulation. Conversation rarely moved in straight lines. It meandered, doubled back, diverged. Yet beneath this apparent disorder lay an unspoken etiquette. Interruptions were tolerated to a point. Excessive dominance drew subtle resistance. Those who listened attentively earned respect equal to those who spoke boldly. The tavern did not abolish social norms. It reshaped them into fluid patterns. For many, these hours constituted the most vivid portion of the day. Labor sustained the body. Fellowship sustained the spirit. The distinction was rarely articulated, yet it was felt. To sit among familiar faces, to feel the rise and fall of shared laughter, to sense one's presence acknowledged, this countered the isolation that could creep in when work demanded solitary focus. Boredom, in its early unnamed form, thrived in silence unshared. The tavern diluted that silence. And yet the regulation that hovered over village recreation lingered here as well, though in subtler form. Excess remained suspect. Voices that rose too sharply might attract unwanted attention. Gatherings that extended too late risked disapproval. Participants understood these limits instinctively. They modulated themselves accordingly. A story that veered toward dangerous territory might be softened. A debate that grew too heated might be redirected. Self-awareness threaded through the energy, preventing it from tipping into something authorities feared. What makes the tavern particularly compelling in the story of leisure is its intimacy. Unlike public festivals or sanctioned games, its gatherings were smaller, more frequent, woven into the ordinary week rather than reserved for special occasions. This regularity made it foundational. It was not spectacle, it was habit. Habit, in turn, shapes identity. Those who met consistently formed bonds that extended beyond the table. They cooperated in work, supported one another in difficulty, remembered shared moments long after they had passed. As towns expanded in later centuries, the function of such spaces would evolve, taking on new shapes and responding to new pressures. Yet in their earlier form, they represented something deeply human and remarkably consistent: the need to process experience aloud. Long before formal institutions absorbed that role, these rooms held it quietly. They offered a setting in which the day could be unfolded, piece by piece, before attentive ears. What had felt tangled in the mind during solitary labor could be laid out in speech, reordered by narration, softened by response. In the fields, thought could become repetitive, circling the same concerns without interruption, replaying minor frustrations or unspoken doubts with increasing intensity. The rhythm of work did not always dispel such thoughts. At times, it reinforced them. Alone at night, when darkness settled and tasks were complete, those same thoughts could grow heavier, still unchallenged by alternative perspective. Silence and isolation magnified what lingered beneath it. In company, however, thought moved differently. Once spoken, it ceased to echo, only within the self. It was examined by others, turned gently from side to side, laughed at when appropriate, contradicted when necessary. Even disagreement could lighten its weight because it transformed inward certainty into shared exploration. Through this movement, this circulation of words and responses, experience lost some of its oppressive quality. What had pressed inward began to disperse outward, and in dispersing, it became more manageable, more proportionate, less solitary. There were evenings when the room grew unusually quiet, perhaps after news of hardship or uncertainty. In such moments, fellowship manifested differently. Silence shared among many felt unlike silence born alone. It carried understanding rather than emptiness. Even without words, presence communicated reassurance. Idleness, so morally charged in sermons, took on another shade here. Sitting without immediate task in the company of others did not signify neglect. It signified connection. And yet, as always, the balance required care. Too much intensity, too much unchecked energy could strain the fragile trust between community and authority. Thus, participants learned to sense when the evening had reached its natural limit. Conversations slowed, gestures softened. One by one, figures rose from benches, nodding farewell. The door opened and closed, letting night air cool the room. Outside the village lay quiet cottages, darkened, save for faint glows behind shuttered windows. Walking home, individuals carried with them the residue of shared energy. The path felt shorter. The night felt less vast. Where solitary hours might once have seemed heavy, they now felt buffered by memory of laughter and exchange. The tavern's warmth lingered, not only in the body, but in the mind. It served as a reminder that time could be shaped collectively, that empty stretches need not expand without contour. In the broader pattern of Old England's struggle with idleness, the tavern stands not as defiance, but as adaptation. It neither rejected moral caution nor surrendered to it entirely. It occupied a middle ground where fellowship justified gathering and conversation, justified pause. Within its walls, leisure was neither condemned nor unbounded. It was lived, negotiated, moderated by those who participated. If one listens closely to the echoes that remain, one hears not merely noise, but rhythm, the murmur of voices blending into a steady hum, the scrape of a bench against floorboards, the soft closing of a door at evening's end. These sounds speak of a society learning again and again how to fill its hours without fracturing its order. In the tavern's modest glow, boredom found less room to take root. It was met not with spectacle, but with presence. And presence shared and steady proved one of the most enduring answers to the quiet weight of time. There came a moment, gradual rather than sudden, when the rhythm that had long governed English villages began to loosen. It did not vanish, it thinned. Roads widened, trade intensified, and towns pressed outward beyond their older boundaries. The countryside did not disappear, but its cadence no longer set the tempo for everyone. In growing urban spaces, time rearranged itself. It no longer followed the patient arc of planting and harvest alone. It followed bells of factories, schedules of workshops, the measured ticking of clocks mounted in public view. The day acquired sharper edges. In a village, pauses had felt organic. Waiting belonged to the land. In towns, waiting felt different. It occurred between shifts, between deliveries, between the closing of one task and the uncertain beginning of another. The body might still be tired, yet the mind remained alert in a new way. Surrounded by more people than ever before, one could nonetheless feel a peculiar isolation. The fields had offered solitude without anonymity. The town offered proximity without intimacy. Picture a narrow street at dusk, lined with brick buildings pressed shoulder to shoulder. Windows glow faintly, yet the light does not spill far. Footsteps echo against stone, blending with the distant rumble of carts. Faces pass quickly, unfamiliar and unremarked. A man finishes his day's labor and steps into this current of motion. He is no longer bound to the open horizon. He is enclosed by architecture, by routine, by the steady repetition of tasks performed not in sunlight, but under constrained light. The day has been full, yet when it ends, something unsettled lingers. In villages, recreation emerged from shared necessity and memory. In towns, leisure begins to separate from labor more distinctly. Work is confined to specific hours. When those hours conclude, the individual stands before a stretch of time that does not automatically fill itself with communal ritual. There are more people, yet fewer familiar faces. The clearing near the church is replaced by streets that do not naturally invite gathering. Silence in a cottage had once been softened by shared recognition. Silence in a rented room feels thinner. It is here that the sensation later called boredom begins to sharpen. Not because people suddenly have nothing to do, but because the structure that once guided transitions between work and rest weakens. The body knows how to labor. It does not yet know how to inhabit time, detached from communal rhythm. The mind, unoccupied by immediate necessity, circles back upon itself. Thoughts accumulate without the easy dispersal that tavern fellowship once provided. Even in spaces designed for conversation, the density of urban life introduces a new form of caution. Strangers sit close, yet trust does not flow as readily. The town offers distractions, markets, performances, shops, but it also imposes repetition. The same street walked daily, the same sounds repeated at fixed intervals. the same routine unfolding with mechanical reliability. What once felt like seasonal change now feels like cyclical sameness. In fields, monotony had been broken by weather and growth. In workshops, monotony acquires a steadier beat. The mind, confronted with repetition, begins to feel its own edges more distinctly. This shift does not announce itself dramatically. It is sensed in small ways. A worker sits after supper and finds that stillness presses harder than before. The room is smaller, the walls closer. Outside noise continues, yet it does not invite participation. It passes like distant current. Inside, time stretches without texture. In villages, the same stillness might have been filled by remembered voices or anticipation of next gathering. In towns, anticipation lacks familiar anchor. Urban time is precise in a way that feels almost tactile. Clocks grow more prominent, mounted in workshops, displayed in public spaces, carried in pockets as instruments of alignment. Their steady ticking introduces a rhythm that does not bend to weather or season. Hours are counted rather than estimated by the angle of sunlight or the length of shadow. The day no longer stretches and contracts organically. It advances in measured increments. This precision sharpens awareness of duration. Time ceases to be something one moves within unconsciously and becomes instead something observed, tracked, divided. One becomes conscious not only of tasks completed, but of minutes remaining. The mind begins to calculate how long until the shift ends, how many intervals remain before the next obligation. Attention turns forward, anticipating the next mark on the clock's face. When work ceases, the contrast becomes acute. The sudden absence of directive stands out more starkly because it follows such deliberate structure. The body, accustomed to responding to measured demands, pauses, and the pause feels defined rather than diffuse. In that moment, the mind registers the absence of instruction with unusual clarity. Without communal structure to guide the transition from labor to leisure, it must generate its own pattern. The precision that organized the day does not automatically extend into the evening. Instead, it leaves behind a quiet awareness of passing minutes, each one perceptible. Time once counted externally now unfolds internally, and the responsibility for shaping it shifts inward. It is not that towns eliminate fellowship. Rather, fellowship must be sought deliberately. Spaces of gathering do exist, but they no longer sit at the center of life by default. They compete with fatigue, with distance, with the subtle anonymity that urban growth fosters. A person may stand among hundreds and still feel unseen. In such conditions, the experience of empty time shifts from moral concern to psychological weight. In earlier centuries, idleness had been framed as spiritual neglect, a deviation measured against doctrine and judged within a moral framework that felt external and authoritative. The language surrounding it carried the weight of warning. It implied consequence beyond the immediate moment, tying empty hours to deeper concerns about discipline and faith. In the town, however, the concern becomes less theological and more internal. The emphasis shifts almost imperceptibly. The individual no longer primarily fears condemnation. Instead, he becomes aware of an unsettled feeling that rises without clear accusation attached to it. The sensation is subtler yet persistent. It does not speak in the stern tones of sermon or admonition. It manifests as restlessness, as an inability to remain at ease within unstructured time. The moral vocabulary of sloth remains echoing faintly in cultural memory, yet alongside it arises a quieter question, less accusatory, and more searching: what should be done with these hours? The inquiry is not always urgent, but it is steady. It accompanies the individual into rooms lit by fading light and into evenings that stretch without clear form. The question does not always find immediate answer. It lingers, hovering just beneath conscious thought, neither demanding resolution nor fully retreating. It becomes part of the texture of urban existence, shaping awareness of time, not through fear of wrongdoing, but through the simple recognition that unfilled hours now require deliberate response. There is a paradox in this environment. Urban life expands opportunity while narrowing intimacy. It multiplies encounters while diluting familiarity. It offers novelty while imposing routine. Within this paradox, mental emptiness takes root in unexpected corners. One might attend a market bustling with voices and still return home feeling unmoored. The mind, overstimulated and underconnected, oscillates between noise and vacancy. The architecture of towns contributes subtly to this sensation. Narrow corridors, layered dwellings, rooms stacked above rooms, these compress space. Compression alters perception of time. A horizon once measured by fields now ends at brick. Movement becomes linear rather than expansive. Without the wide visual field of countryside, the mind turns inward more readily. And yet within this emerging emptiness lies potential. The mind, unanchored from strict communal pattern, begins to wander in new ways. Reflection deepens. Imagination expands beyond immediate surroundings. Where village life reinforced continuity, urban life introduces possibility. The very restlessness that unsettles also stimulates. Thought grows exploratory. Still, the transition is not seamless. Many experience unease before they experience creativity. The absence of inherited rhythm feels like loss. The tavern's warmth exists, but it competes with countless other spaces. The village green's clarity dissolves into crowded streets. The internal negotiation with time intensifies. Consider a craftsman newly arrived in a growing town. He completes his assigned labor in a workshop that echoes with the same repetitive sounds each day. When evening comes, he steps outside, not into familiar faces, but into motion without memory. He may find a place to sit, to speak, to listen. Yet the path to that place requires decision. Decision itself becomes a burden. In the village, leisure had been predictable. In the town, it demands choice. Choice introduces awareness. Awareness magnifies emptiness. The craftsman becomes conscious of his own thoughts in a way that previous rhythms prevented. He notices the echo of footsteps in his rented room. He senses the quiet between distant street noises. He feels the weight of hours unstructured by inherited custom. This is not idleness in the older sense. It is something more subtle, a psychological awareness of time passing without clear form. Urban growth also alters generational patterns. Younger individuals adapt more quickly to shifting rhythms. Older ones carry the memory of communal cadence and feel its absence more sharply. This generational contrast adds texture to the experience of mental emptiness. It is not uniform, it varies. In markets and workshops, conversation remains lively. Yet once separated from those spaces, individuals confront the private dimension of urban time. The mental emptiness that emerges is not always distressing. Sometimes it invites introspection. Sometimes it invites innovation. But it rarely goes unnoticed. The town, in expanding, changes not only geography, but consciousness. It fragments time into measurable units and separates labor from leisure more distinctly than before. It surrounds individuals with others, yet leaves them responsible for shaping their own transitions between work and rest. In that responsibility lies both freedom and vulnerability. As night deepens over brick and stone, and as windows dim one by one, a different kind of silence settles. It is not the silence of fields, but the hush between distant sounds. Within that hush, thoughts move differently. They linger longer. They press inward. The individual senses the space between tasks not merely as pause, but as presence. Mental emptiness acquires outline. This is the threshold from which a new understanding of boredom will later emerge. Not yet named fully, not yet dissected, but forming quietly. The moral shadow of idleness still hovers in cultural memory, yet alongside it grows a new sensation, one tied less to accusation and more to awareness. The city does not condemn empty time, it exposes it, and so the rhythm continues to shift. The village's steady pulse gives way to the town's layered tempo. In that layering, minds adapt struggle and gradually reshape their relationship with unfilled hours. The silence between bells grows more noticeable. The ticking of clocks becomes more pronounced. And within the measured precision of urban time, the human spirit begins to search for new ways to steady itself against the quiet weight of passing moments. There is a quiet moment in history when a feeling acquires a name, and in being named, it sharpens. Before that moment, the feeling exists in fragments described indirectly hinted at through metaphors of weariness or dullness, wrapped in older moral language that does not fully capture its texture. But once a word settles into speech, it gathers those fragments and binds them together. In 19th century England, such a binding began to occur. The experience that had long hovered between idleness and restlessness, between spiritual caution and social unease, began to take shape under a new term. It was not entirely new as sensation. It was new as recognition. Urban growth had intensified awareness of time's empty stretches. Work was measured with precision. Leisure was separated more distinctly from obligation. The mind, freed from constant physical exertion, yet surrounded by routine, became attentive to its own stagnation. In earlier centuries, a person might have described a long afternoon as tiresome or tedious. Now there emerged a subtler acknowledgement. Something inside resisted repetition itself. It was not simply that the task was hard, it was that the spirit felt unengaged. The vocabulary shifted accordingly. Words do more than describe. They organize experience. When boredom entered conversation, it allowed individuals to articulate a discomfort that had previously dissolved into vaguer terms. To say one was bored was not to confess sin, nor to admit laziness. It was to admit a mismatch between time and attention. It acknowledged that the structure of the day no longer sufficed to occupy the mind. This distinction altered the emotional landscape. Consider a clerk seated at a narrow desk in a growing town, copying figures in ledgers that stretch line after line in uniform columns. The room is orderly, the instructions clear. There is no moral failure in the act, and yet after hours of repetition, the numbers blur. The mind wanders not toward temptation, but toward vacancy. The sensation is not guilt, it is dullness edged with agitation. Previously, such a state might have been dismissed as fatigue. Now, with a word emerging to frame it, it gains coherence. It becomes an identifiable condition. The rise of print culture amplified this shift in ways that were both visible and subtle. Newspapers circulated more widely, carrying not only reports of events, but reflections, commentary, and serialized narratives that entered homes with regularity. Novels multiplied their pages, filled with characters whose inner lives were rendered with increasing detail. Essays turned their gaze inward, examining moods, doubts, and fluctuations of feeling with a seriousness once reserved for moral instruction. Language grew more attentive to nuance, more willing to linger over states of mind that might previously have been dismissed as trivial or fleeting. Readers encountered characters who named their own dissatisfaction, who confessed to ennui or weariness, not as spiritual lapses, but as psychological experiences, as conditions of the mind rather than failures of virtue. These portrayals did not condemn, they described. They unfolded slowly, allowing readers to inhabit the same restless hours, the same unsettled reflections. In encountering these descriptions, readers recognized themselves. They saw mirrored in ink what they had felt in quiet moments, but perhaps had not articulated. Recognition did not simply comfort, it clarified. The act of seeing one's own interior state reflected in another's words sharpened perception. Awareness deepened, and with it, the sense that this experience was shared, rather than singular, defined, rather than diffuse. The word itself carried a certain resonance. It suggested intrusion, something that bored into consciousness, pressing inward persistently. It conveyed not mere emptiness, but irritation with emptiness. This nuance distinguished it from earlier moral terminology. Sloth implied neglect of duty. Boredom implied a hunger for stimulation. The moral accusation softened, replaced by self-observation. This does not mean moral language disappeared. It lingered layered beneath the new term. But the emphasis shifted from judgment to description. One could be industrious and still be bored. One could fulfill every obligation and yet feel restless. This possibility marked a profound change. It separated the experience of mental emptiness from visible inactivity. Boredom could arise even within structured labor. As cities expanded and education broadened, awareness of interior life intensified. Diaries and letters reveal increasing attention to moods and reflections. Individuals began to map their own states with greater precision. Where once a long evening might have been endured silently, now it might be recorded as tedious, dull, or explicitly boring. The act of writing reinforced the term's presence. Language circulated through ink and paper, embedding itself in cultural consciousness. There is something almost paradoxical about naming boredom. The more clearly it is articulated, the more sharply it is felt. Before it had a name, discomfort might dissipate into general fatigue. After naming it stands distinct. A person sits in a drawing room, surrounded by polite conversation that neither offends nor excites, and recognizes the sensation as boredom. The recognition adds a layer to the experience. It becomes not only a feeling, but a concept. The 19th century, with its increasing attention to individuality, provided fertile ground for such conceptual clarity. Industrialization reordered labor. Urbanization reordered space. Print culture reordered thought. Within this confluence, the mind found itself both stimulated and confined. The proliferation of information created new expectations for engagement. When engagement faltered, the absence felt more pronounced. This emergence of boredom as a named experience did not occur overnight. It seeped gradually into speech and literature. Yet once present, it altered how people interpreted time. No longer merely a sequence of duties and rests, time became something that could fail to satisfy. The failure was not always dramatic. It might manifest as a quiet sigh, a restless shift in posture, a glance toward the clock. But it was now intelligible as a shared condition. Shared conditions invite shared solutions. As boredom gained recognition, so too did attempts to counter it. Reading conversation spectacle, these acquired renewed importance. They were not simply pleasant diversions, they became remedies. The marketplace responded subtly. More printed matter appeared. Public lectures drew audiences. Entertainment, though still evolving, began to align with the need to engage minds as well as bodies. Yet for all this movement toward stimulation, boredom retained a certain inevitability. It accompanied routine even as routine intensified. It lingered in households where evenings stretched without clear purpose. It surfaced in social gatherings that adhered too strictly to convention. It appeared in workplaces that demanded repetition without variation. Naming it did not banish it, it made it visible. There is a particular poignancy in this visibility. Once a feeling is named, individuals recognize that others share it. Boredom becomes communal in a new way, not through gathering in fields or taverns, but through mutual acknowledgement. A character in a novel expresses it. A reader nods inwardly. A friend mentions it in passing. Another understands. What had once been internal and diffuse becomes a point of connection. And yet the word carries ambivalence. To confess boredom can imply dissatisfaction with circumstances that others accept. It can suggest a certain privilege, the space to feel unfulfilled rather than merely exhausted. Thus, boredom sits at the intersection of modern awareness and social nuance. It reflects both expanded consciousness and the challenges that accompany it. As night falls over the 19th century town, and as gaslight flickers along streets newly illuminated, individuals retire to rooms shaped not only by brick and plaster, but by this new vocabulary that now accompanies their private thoughts. The glow from lamps casts soft halos against ceilings, stretching shadows that sway faintly with each passing draft. Outside, the city hums at a lower pitch, no longer crowded with the urgency of the day, but not yet surrendered to full silence. Inside, the space feels both contained and reflective. The walls seem closer than open countryside once did, and within that closeness, awareness sharpens. Some reach for books, fingers turning pages, not merely for information, but for immersion, for movement of the mind that counters the stillness of the body. Others seek conversation, allowing voices to fill the room, so that thought does not circle too narrowly upon itself. A few sit quietly, neither reading nor speaking, attentive to the faint ticking of a clock or the distant murmur from the street below. In such moments, they are aware of the slow drift of minutes as something tangible, something that presses gently yet persistently against consciousness. In that awareness lies the legacy of the word. What might once have been felt as an indistinct heaviness or a vague restlessness now possesses outline. The sensation has edges. It can be recognized, even anticipated. The vocabulary does not eliminate the experience, it frames it. It has given contour to what once lay unnamed, tracing a boundary around a feeling that previously dissolved into the background of long evenings. Now, when silence lingers or attention falters, the mind identifies the state with clarity. And in that clarity, the interior life becomes more visible to itself, illuminated as softly and steadily as the gaslight outside. The birth of boredom does not erase the earlier history of idleness. Instead, it reframes it. Where once the empty hour threatened moral decay, it now threatens mental stagnation. The locus of concern shifts inward. Authority no longer stands primarily at the threshold. The individual does. He evaluates his own engagement, measures his own satisfaction, questions his own restlessness. And so, the story of leisure evolves again, not in abrupt rupture, but in gradual transformation, like a river that alters its course without ever ceasing to flow. What once unfolded in open clearings under watchful skies now unfolds behind windows and within quieter rooms. From regulated village gatherings to urban solitude, from spaces defined by collective rhythm to hours shaped by individual perception, the movement is subtle yet unmistakable. Where leisure once required negotiation with visible authority, it now requires negotiation within the self. From moral suspicion to psychological articulation, the shift is profound. Earlier generations had measured unfilled time against standards of virtue and obedience. Questions of idleness were framed in the language of duty restraint and spiritual vigilance. Now, though those echoes remain, a different emphasis rises. The discomfort associated with empty hours no longer depends primarily on external judgment. It emerges from inward awareness, from the recognition that something within feels unstirred or underengaged. The arc bends toward interiority, drawing attention away from public conformity and toward private experience. The naming of boredom marks a turning point precisely because it captures this inward turn. It crystallizes a sensation that had long been diffused across other terms and moral categories. In naming it, society acknowledges that time's weight is no longer interpreted solely through doctrine or communal rhythm. It is interpreted through self-awareness, through the individual's perception of engagement and meaning. The clock may still measure hours, and custom may still suggest how they should be spent, but the final reckoning now occurs within the mind itself. Within that self-awareness lies both vulnerability and possibility. To feel boredom is to recognize a desire for more stimulation, more meaning, more variation. The word carries quiet longing. It acknowledges that existence, even when orderly, may lack resonance. And in that acknowledgement, a new chapter in England's relationship with time begins to unfold, shaped not only by external regulation, but by the interior life of those who inhabit it. Before the music halls blazed with gaslight, and before large stages gathered hundreds into a single room of spectacle, there were smaller rooms where a quieter revolution unfolded. They did not announce themselves as transformative. They were simply rooms with tables, chairs, newspapers laid out within reach, and a steady hum of voices that never quite dissolved into silence. The coffee house did not resemble the village green, nor did it echo the tavern exactly. It occupied a different space in the evolving landscape of leisure, less tied to physical exertion, more devoted to the movement of thought. To step inside such a place in 18th or early 19th century England was to enter a current of words. Conversations overlapped without collapsing into chaos. A man might sit with a pamphlet unfolded before him, pausing to read a paragraph aloud, inviting commentary. Another might respond not with agreement, but with interpretation. News traveled not only across paper, but across lips. The air felt charged not with music, but with speculation. Unlike the village gatherings that reaffirmed shared identity through tradition, the coffee house fostered a culture of inquiry. It did not abandon fellowship. It reconfigured it. Instead of synchronizing bodies through dance, it synchronized attention through dialogue. Individuals leaned inward, elbows resting on polished wood eyes, bright with the urgency of exchange. Words became instruments for shaping time. In an urban environment where mental emptiness had begun to sharpen into conscious boredom, the coffee house offered a remedy distinct from mere distraction. It provided engagement, not spectacle yet, but stimulation. A man who had spent his day in repetitive labor could enter this space and find his mind challenged rather than dulled. A clerk, weary of columns and calculations, might argue the implications of a newly printed essay. The experience was not restful in the pastoral sense. It was invigorating. The rhythm within these rooms differed from both field and tavern in ways that were subtle yet unmistakable. It was neither shaped by the open sweep of landscape nor by the easy familiarity of long-standing companionship. The tavern had softened the day's weight through familiarity and shared memory, allowing laughter and recognition to smooth the rough edges of labor. Its warmth lay in repetition, in the comfort of known faces and well-worn stories. The coffee house, by contrast, did not primarily soothe. It sharpened awareness. The air seemed charged not with nostalgia, but with anticipation. Conversations did not simply revisit what had already been lived. They reached outward, probing beyond the immediate circle. It invited participation in exchanges that extended beyond the boundaries of neighborhood and kinship. Voices carried fragments of distant developments, printed words, bridged spaces that no traveler could traverse in a single day. Ideas circulated steadily, sometimes clashing, as differing interpretations met, sometimes merging into unexpected alignment, each exchange adding texture to the collective hum. Even disagreement carried a certain vitality, as if friction itself generated light. When patrons eventually rose to leave, they did not carry only the echo of voices, but a residue of curiosity that lingered long after departure. Thoughts continued to unfold in the mind, connections forming and reforming in quiet reflection. The room's rhythm followed them outward, persisting in memory as an undercurrent that gently unsettled and invigorated in equal measure. There is something almost paradoxical about the culture of talk as a response to boredom. One might imagine that endless conversation could itself become tedious. Yet the novelty of topics, the unpredictability of exchange, and the immediacy of response countered monotony. Where solitude magnified restlessness, dialogue dispersed it. The mind, instead of turning inward, repetitively expanded outward, testing new angles. In these spaces, leisure and information intertwined so seamlessly that it became difficult to distinguish where one ended and the other began. Reading was rarely silent for long. Even when eyes first moved quietly across the printed page, the impulse to share soon followed. A phrase would be repeated aloud, a headline questioned, a paragraph weighed against lived experience. The printed word did not remain confined to paper. It entered the air, took on tone and inflection, and invited a response. A line from a newspaper might spark debate, not necessarily heated, but attentive and layered. A political development might ignite speculation, drawing voices into cautious analysis or spirited disagreement. The act of reading shifted from solitary absorption to collective engagement. The coffee house thus became more than a site of refreshment or casual gathering. It functioned as a chamber where the interior life of individuals intersected with the broader currents of society. Private reflections, once confined to the mind, found articulation and were tested against other perspectives. Ideas circulated alongside news, each shaping the other in subtle ways. The room itself seemed to hold these exchanges. Its atmosphere thickened not by silence, but by shared attention. Time spent here did not feel empty. It felt invested. Minutes were not merely passing. They were being used, shaped, directed toward understanding. The weight that might have accompanied idle hours elsewhere dissolved into purposeful engagement, replaced by the sense that one's presence and thought contributed to something ongoing and collective. Yet, as with all spaces of gathering, awareness of regulation lingered in subtle forms. The presence of diverse opinions required self-restraint. Disagreement was permitted, even encouraged, but not without limits. Participants learned to navigate tone-to-balance assertion with attentiveness. The social intelligence cultivated here mirrored the calibrated joy of village recreation, though its medium was different. The culture of talk also altered the perception of time itself. In solitude, minutes drifted heavily. In conversation, they seemed to fold. An hour might pass unnoticed when minds engaged deeply. The clock remained on the wall, its ticking steady, yet attention detached from it. Engagement created elasticity in duration. There is an intimacy to shared intellectual discovery. When two strangers lean over the same printed page, tracing arguments and questioning conclusions, they construct a temporary alliance. The act of thinking together dissolves the sharp edges of anonymity that urban life otherwise fosters. In this way, the coffeehouse countered not only boredom, but isolation. The content of conversation varied widely: commerce, politics, literature, everyday concerns. Yet beneath these topics lay a consistent pattern: the validation of interior experience through external exchange. Individuals who had become aware of their own mental restlessness found here a structured outlet. Thought did not stagnate, it circulated. The architecture of the coffeehouse supported this circulation in ways that felt almost intuitive, as though the space itself understood the purpose it was meant to serve. Tables arranged in proximity encouraged overlapping discussion, allowing one exchange to brush gently against another without dissolving into confusion. Voices carried across short distances, not loudly, but clearly enough to be heard, and if desired, joined. Newspapers placed centrally invited collective engagement. They did not belong to a single reader for long, but passed from hand to hand, unfolding and refolding as perspectives shifted. Chairs angled slightly inward fostered attentiveness, drawing bodies into a subtle circle, even when no formal gathering had been declared. The arrangement suggested participation without enforcing it. Even the ambient noise, the steady murmur of conversation, the soft scrape of wood against floor, the rustle of paper created a sense of belonging. One was rarely alone, yet one's voice mattered. To speak was to enter a current already flowing. To listen was to feel its movement without being submerged. It is important to recognize that these spaces were not accessible to all in equal measure. Social boundaries persisted, shaping who entered freely and who remained outside. The inclusiveness of conversation did not erase the distinctions of class or circumstance. Yet within their sphere, these rooms marked a shift from communal ritual to conversational culture. The village green had reaffirmed continuity through repetition and shared custom. The coffeehouse invited reinterpretation through dialogue and exchange. One looked backward to tradition, the other forward to possibility. Together, they reveal a society gradually reimagining how time might be filled not only with movement or memory, but with thought. In such rooms, boredom transformed from a private discomfort into a stimulus for participation. The individual who felt the weight of unstructured hours could choose to enter a space where those hours would be filled not by movement, but by meaning-making. Words layered upon words created texture in time. Evenings within these establishments often extended beyond daylight lamps, casting steady illumination over pages and faces. The hum did not crescendo dramatically. It maintained a consistent pulse. When participants finally rose to leave, stepping back into narrow streets, they carried with them ideas that continued to unfold internally. Conversation echoed in memory, sustaining engagement beyond the room. The coffee house thus stands as a bridge in the evolution of leisure, positioned quietly between what had been and what was still emerging. It does not reject earlier forms of gathering. It reframes them, preserving their impulse toward connection while altering their medium. The instinct to assemble remains unchanged, yet the manner of assembly shifts. What had once relied on shared motion or shared familiarity now leans into shared reflection. The continuity lies not in the activity itself, but in the underlying need it fulfills. Where village recreation synchronized bodies, aligning steps, gestures, and physical presence within visible patterns, and tavern fellowship synchronized emotion, softening burdens through laughter, memory and recognition, coffee house discourse synchronized intellect. It brought minds into alignment through exchange, not by erasing difference, but by engaging it. Thought moved between individuals the way rhythm once moved through dancers. Ideas replaced steps. Interpretation replaced repetition. The result was a different kind of harmony, one less visible, yet no less cohesive. Each form responded to the shifting experience of time in its own way. The village green filled hours with movement that dissolved solitude. The tavern filled them with warmth that eased fatigue. The coffee house filled them with conversation that animated awareness. Together, they trace an arc in which leisure becomes progressively interior, increasingly attentive to the mind's engagement with passing moments. As urban life intensified and print culture expanded further, the appetite for structured engagement grew. The culture of talk prepared the ground for more elaborate forms of entertainment. It accustomed minds to stimulation beyond routine labor. It demonstrated that leisure could be active without being physical communal, without being ritualized. And yet the essence remained human and immediate. A man leaning forward to challenge an argument, a reader pausing mid-sentence to invite interpretation, a shared laugh at a clever remark. These gestures, small and repeated, formed the heartbeat of the room. When night deepened and the last patrons departed, the coffee house returned to stillness. Chairs rested in place. Newspapers lay folded. Outside, the city's sounds softened. But within those walls, time had been shaped differently than in solitude. It had been filled deliberately. In the broader arc of England's response to boredom, the coffee house represents a turning toward mental vitality. It affirms that the answer to emptiness need not always be spectacle. It can be exchange. It can be the simple yet profound act of thinking aloud in the presence of others. And so, as urban clocks continued to measure hours with increasing precision, and as individuals grew more aware of their interior states, the culture of talk provided a steady counterbalance. It did not erase boredom entirely, but it transformed its energy. Restlessness became inquiry. Silence became discussion. Time once heavy in solitude found rhythm again in shared words. By the time the 19th century pressed fully into its later decades, England's relationship with leisure had acquired yet another layer. The village green had once offered movement. The tavern had offered warmth. The coffee house had offered thought. Now, a new environment began to dominate certain evenings rooms, built not merely for gathering, but for watching. The culture of talk did not disappear, yet it was joined and sometimes overshadowed by the culture of spectacle. Gaslight brighter and steadier than candle altered the possibilities of night. Streets no longer surrendered so quickly to darkness. Interiors could be illuminated with greater intensity. Where earlier generations had relied on the intimacy of small circles, larger audiences now became possible. The music hall emerged as a distinct space part, performance part, congregation, part release. Here, leisure was not improvised by participants. It was orchestrated before them. Picture an evening when the working day has ended, and men and women step from factories or offices into streets still alive with light. Instead of drifting toward taverns or conversation, many are drawn toward venues where tickets are purchased, seats assigned, and anticipation hums before a curtain. The air is different from that of the coffee house. It carries expectation rather than debate. Voices murmur not to exchange news, but to await distraction. The spectacle offers something particular in the evolving story of boredom. It promises immersion. In solitude, time can press inward. In conversation, it can expand outward. In spectacle, it dissolves temporarily into narrative and sound. The audience becomes still while the stage moves. Laughter rises not from spontaneous recollection, but from rehearsed performance. Music swells. Jokes land. Acts unfold with rhythm designed to hold attention. There is a curious balance within such spaces. On one hand, they represent escape. On the other, they remain structured, regulated, ticketed. The freedom they offer is carefully framed. The individual surrenders not to chaos, but to choreography. Even in seeking relief from mental restlessness, one enters an environment governed by schedule and sequence. The rise of commercial entertainment reflects a deeper shift in how empty hours are perceived. If boredom has been named and recognized, then there emerges a market for its alleviation. Spectacle becomes commodity. Time becomes something one can purchase, experience to fill. The transaction is subtle, yet significant. Leisure transitions from communal ritual to consumable product. Yet spectacle does not entirely sever the thread of fellowship. Audiences experience emotion collectively. Laughter rolls through the room like a wave. Applause unites strangers in shared response. The individual seated among many feels momentarily synchronized with those around him. This synchronization differs from village dance or coffeehouse debate. It is less participatory, more receptive, yet it still counters isolation. In these halls, performers often draw upon familiar themes, daily frustrations, social changes, political satire. The audience recognizes fragments of their own lives refracted through exaggeration. Recognition produces relief. To see one's own weariness caricatured or dramatized diminishes its sting. Boredom so private in solitude becomes shared through laughter. There is also a certain discipline within spectacle. Shows begin at appointed hours. Acts follow one another in ordered sequence. The audience learns when to respond, when to quiet. Even escape adheres to structure. The architecture of the hall reinforces this pattern, rows aligned toward a single focal point, lights dimmed to concentrate attention forward. The room directs perception. This direction offers a respite from the inward turn that boredom can induce. In solitude, awareness circles back upon itself. In spectacle, attention flows outward toward stage and sound. The mind, relieved from generating its own engagement, rests within the narrative provided. For a few hours, the weight of unstructured time recedes. Yet spectacle cannot eliminate boredom entirely. It can postpone it, mask it, transform it temporarily into amusement. But once the curtain falls and the audience disperses into night streets, the familiar negotiation resumes. The clock still measures hours. The room still waits at home. Spectacle addresses the symptom without dissolving the underlying awareness of time's passing. Still, its significance lies in demonstrating that boredom is not only endured, but managed. Society adapts. Where earlier generations relied on ritual and conversation, later ones add performance. Each adaptation reflects changing conditions, urban density, technological advancement, expanding markets. Leisure evolves in tandem with environment. It is tempting to imagine spectacle as purely frivolous, yet it carries subtle depth. Within the music hall's laughter lies commentary. Within song lies reflection. Performers hold mirrors up to shifting social realities. The audience, though seeking diversion, absorbs interpretation. Thus, even in apparent escape, thought persists beneath surface enjoyment. The rise of organized sport during this period parallels the growth of theatrical entertainment. Large crowds gather not only to watch staged performance, but competitive display. Stadiums echo with cheers. The synchronization of bodies once found on the village green now reappears in regulated form, overseen by rules and schedules. Movement becomes professionalized spectacle. In both theater and sport, participation shifts from collective enactment to collective observation. The individual contributes primarily through presence and reaction. This shift signals a broader cultural transformation. Leisure becomes increasingly specialized, separated from daily labor, and entrusted to designated performers. And yet beneath these layers of structure and commerce, beneath the ticket counters and printed posters, the essential human impulse remains recognizable and unchanged. The setting evolves, the architecture grows grander, the exchange of coins becomes more formalized, but the underlying desire moves along a familiar path. People seek relief from monotony not because they are weak, but because repetition presses steadily against the mind. The rhythm of work, however necessary, can flatten sensation. In response, individuals reach outward for contrast for sound, where there has been silence for movement, where there has been stillness for variation, where routine has settled too deeply. They seek connection, even if mediated through stage or field. Even when participation is indirect, when one sits in darkness, watching illuminated figures perform the presence of others matters. Laughter shared in a crowded hall carries a different texture than laughter alone. Applause rising collectively reshapes the air. Though the performer stands apart, the experience binds those seated together into a temporary unity. The connection is filtered, structured, even commercialized, yet it still answers a need to feel part of something unfolding beyond the self. Above all, they seek to feel time, passing not as burden, but as momentum. There is a profound difference between minutes that drag and minutes that carry. When attention is held, when emotion is stirred, when anticipation replaces vacancy, the clock's steady ticking recedes into the background. Time no longer weighs, it moves. It gathers shape and direction. And in that movement, even if only for an evening, the heaviness that monotony can impose is eased, not erased, but lightened by the simple human act of turning toward one another and toward something shared. As the 19th century edges toward its close, the urban landscape glows brighter at night than ever before. Advertisements announce upcoming performances. Posters promise novelty. The language of entertainment grows exuberant. Beneath this vibrancy lies the quiet acknowledgement that unfilled hours demand response. When the audience exits the hall, stepping back into streets, humming with late activity, there is a brief afterglow that clings to them like warmth retained in fabric after leaving a heated room. The doors swing open, releasing a flow of bodies into air that feels cooler, more ordinary. Yet for a few moments, the ordinary does not fully reclaim its dominance. Snatches of melody linger half-hummed under breath or tapped out softly against coat sleeves. Lines from a comic sketch are repeated, sometimes exaggerated in the retelling, sometimes softened into private smiles. The shared experience extends beyond the walls, carried outward in fragments of sound and memory. For a time, the mind remains engaged. The scenes just witnessed replay in altered sequence. A clever remark resurfaces with delayed appreciation. A chorus echoes faintly, not as loudly as before, but steadily enough to color the walk home. Even the rhythm of footsteps seems to align with what has just been heard. The streetlights flicker above, casting long shadows that stretch and fold as people move through them. Conversation continues in low tones, as though reluctant to relinquish the collective energy entirely. But gradually, as footsteps lead home and doors close behind them, the earlier awareness of interiority returns. The hum of the street fades into distance. Coats are hung, lamps dimmed, rooms resume their familiar stillness. The afterglow softens. What had felt expansive contracts gently back into the contours of private space. The mind, no longer guided by stage or song, turns inward once more. The echo lingers briefly, then settles, and with its settling, the quiet presence of unstructured time reasserts itself, not abruptly, but steadily, as though it had been waiting patiently beyond the noise. Thus, spectacle becomes one chapter in the ongoing negotiation between human consciousness and passing time. It does not replace earlier forms. It layers upon them. The village green tavern, coffee house, and theater each represent attempts to answer the same question: what shall be done with these hours? In answering, society reveals its shifting priorities with a clarity that only hindsight makes visible. The forms of leisure adopted at any given moment are not accidental. They mirror the conditions under which people labor, gather, and think. From communal ritual to intellectual exchange to managed escape, each stage reflects evolving structures of work technology and awareness. When labor was tied to land and season, leisure emerged as shared movement beneath open sky. When cities thickened and print circulated widely, leisure became conversation and contemplation. When industry accelerated pace and urban density intensified, spectacle arose as orchestrated diversion. Each transformation corresponds not merely to taste, but to environment. The naming of boredom sharpened perception by drawing attention inward. It provided a lens through which individuals interpreted their own unease with repetition and unfilled hours. Once articulated, the sensation could no longer be mistaken for simple fatigue or moral lapse. It became something observable, describable, almost measurable in its recurrence. Awareness deepened, and with it came the expectation that time should engage rather than merely pass. The growth of spectacle provided temporary relief within this heightened awareness. It did not eliminate the conditions that gave rise to boredom, nor did it dissolve the interiority that naming had encouraged. Instead, it offered intervals of immersion moments when attention was captured and directed outward with precision. Relief, however, remained bounded by duration. When the curtain fell, time resumed its familiar weight. And so, the negotiation continued, shaped by the ever-changing structures that framed daily life. And so, in the dimming light, after performance ends, when applause fades and streets quiet, the individual carries both memory and anticipation. Memory of laughter shared, anticipation of the next diversion. Between them stretches the familiar space of time awaiting shape. The negotiation continues, as it always has, between solitude and society, between silence and sound, between the weight of minutes and the human desire to lighten them. If one steps back from the glow of gaslight, from the hum of coffee houses, and the echo of music halls, what remains is not a single solution to boredom, but a pattern. The pattern is older than any word used to describe it. It is the steady human effort to negotiate time to shape it, soften it, give it contour when it threatens to flatten experience. By the close of the 19th century, England had accumulated layers of response, ritual, regulation, conversation, spectacle, yet beneath them all lay something quieter, less visible, but perhaps more enduring. Not every hour was filled. Not every evening ended in laughter or debate. There were still rooms where silence stretched across wooden floors, where lamps burned low and thoughts moved slowly. There were still individuals who sat without book or performance, aware of the minute hand's gradual sweep. The difference now was not that such moments existed, but that they were recognized. They had been named. They were no longer confused with sin alone, nor dismissed as mere tiredness. They were part of modern life. Picture a small rented room in an industrial town at the turn of the century. Outside, the city has grown dense, its chimneys etched against the sky even after dusk. Inside, a worker removes his coat, sits by a narrow window, and listens to distant sounds fade. He has attended a performance before. He has visited a coffee house. He knows the language of boredom well enough to identify it. And yet tonight, he does not seek diversion. He allows the quiet to settle. This quiet is not empty in the way earlier centuries might have feared, not a hollow space inviting suspicion or reprimand. It does not automatically suggest moral failure, nor does it inevitably signal psychological distress. It carries no immediate accusation. Instead, it resembles something steadier and more grounded, something closer to endurance. The capacity to remain within unfilled time without immediate escape becomes its own form of adaptation, a learned steadiness in the face of intervals that offer no obvious direction. Where previous generations structured leisure collectively through ritual or gathering that filled the hour from the outside, and the modern individual increasingly learns to structure it internally. The shaping of time becomes less dependent on shared choreography and more reliant on private orientation. There is a subtle maturity in this shift, one that does not dismiss earlier forms of engagement, but places them within a broader framework. It does not reject spectacle or conversation. It contextualizes them. The worker knows he can seek stimulation when desired, that diversion remains available should restlessness intensify. Yet he also knows that not every silence requires remedy, not every pause demands filling. The awareness of boredom, once sharp and unsettling, becomes part of a larger self-understanding. It loses some of its urgency, some of its sting. He recognizes the restlessness when it arises, acknowledging its presence without alarm. But he also recognizes its ebb. It moves through him as part of the cycle of attention and release, no longer an adversary to overcome, but a rhythm to inhabit. England's journey through centuries of shifting leisure thus culminates not in a final invention, but in a deeper interior resilience. The village green synchronized bodies, the tavern synchronized feeling, the coffee house synchronized thought, the theater synchronized attention. But in the private room alone, something else synchronizes awareness with patience. Modernity brings acceleration, but it also brings fragmentation, and the two move together in ways that are not always immediately visible. Work is no longer seasonal. It is scheduled, divided into shifts and segments that begin and end by the authority of the clock, rather than by the turning of weather or the ripening of crops. Days are partitioned with precision. Information no longer arrives occasionally carried by traveler or weekly paper. It circulates constantly, flowing through print announcement and conversation in steady succession. There is little pause between one development and the next. Spectacle no longer waits for evening as a singular event. It proliferates, multiplying across venues and occasions available not as rarity, but as option. In such an environment, boredom does not disappear simply because stimulation increases. It adapts, it shifts shape. It hides in repetition, even when repetition is surrounded by noise. It settles into overstimulation, where the abundance of impressions dulls rather than sharpens attention. It lingers in the paradox of abundance, where the presence of many choices does not automatically yield satisfaction. The mind, confronted with constant movement, can still experience vacancy, and so the question persists with quiet persistence: what shall be done with these hours? By the early 20th century, new forms of entertainment emerge. Cinema flickers onto screens. Organized sport expands into larger arenas. Public parks provide structured recreation framed by paths and schedules. Each carries novelty, promising immersion and relief. Yet the underlying negotiation remains familiar. Each innovation promises engagement. Each addresses the human desire to feel time as movement rather than wait, to sense forward motion rather than stagnation. And each, despite its brightness and energy, leaves intact the quiet moments between engagements. When the film ends, when the match concludes, when the park empties at dusk, the intervals return. Time resumes its steady presence, awaiting once more the individual's response. The inheritance of earlier centuries is not the eradication of boredom, but the normalization of its presence, the quiet acceptance that it will appear and recede as part of ordinary life. Where once idleness was policed with suspicion and later boredom was named with a certain unease, now it becomes a recognized aspect of consciousness, neither wholly condemned nor urgently feared. It is understood as a condition that accompanies awareness rather than a flaw that demands immediate correction. The modern individual carries within him the memory of communal solutions, ritual, gathering, conversation, spectacle, and alongside that memory, the expectation of personal agency. He knows that time can be shaped collectively, yet he also knows that its shaping often begins within. There is something profoundly human in this continuity. Despite technological change and urban growth, despite the acceleration of schedules and the proliferation of distraction, the essential impulse remains steady. People seek relief from monotony not out of weakness, but out of an instinct for variation. They seek connection, whether through shared laughter, shared thought, or shared silence. They seek to experience the passage of time not as stagnation, but as unfolding as movement that carries meaning rather than weight. Yet they also learn gradually to endure intervals that resist easy shaping. They discover that not every hour must be transformed to be born, and that within even the quietest stretches of time, there exists the simple, enduring act of remaining present. Imagine an evening in the early 20th century when the worker, now older, sits once again by the same narrow window. The frame is familiar beneath his hand, though the world beyond it has altered. Outside, electric lights have replaced gas, casting a steadier, whiter glow across pavements that seem busier than before. The city's rhythm has quickened. Footsteps pass more frequently. Wheels move faster, distant sounds overlap in a continuous murmur. Newspapers are thicker, their pages filled with more columns, more headlines, more fragments of a world expanding in reach. Entertainment is more varied, more accessible, more immediate. Yet the room remains still. The walls hold the same quiet they always have. The chair creaks in the same measured way. He no longer fears the quiet as something accusatory or oppressive. He recognizes it as part of the cycle, as inevitable as the passing of light from window to shadow. The story of how people in Old England dealt with boredom is not a tale of conquest, not a narrative in which an enemy was identified and permanently subdued. It is a tale of accommodation, of gradual adjustment across centuries. Regulation did not erase idleness. It framed it within boundaries. Conversation did not eliminate restlessness. It redirected its energy into exchange. Spectacle did not abolish interiority. It temporarily eclipsed it with brightness and sound. And quiet endurance did not defeat boredom. It integrated it, absorbing it into the rhythm of ordinary life. Through these layered responses, boredom was neither vanquished nor ignored. It was acknowledged, shaped, and carried forward as part of the human experience of time itself. Time continues to pass with impartial steadiness. Clocks tick, whether watched or ignored. Streets hum, whether crowded or empty. The human task remains constant to inhabit these passing hours with intention, whether through movement, dialogue, observation, or simple presence. If there is a lesson carried forward, it lies not in any single space. The green, the tavern, the coffee house, the hall, but in the capacity to shift between them. Flexibility becomes strength. The ability to seek stimulation when needed and accept stillness when unavoidable becomes the hallmark of adaptation. In this sense, the evolution of leisure in England mirrors a broader human pattern. Societies respond to boredom not by erasing it, but by diversifying the ways it can be addressed. Ritual, intellect, spectacle, and solitude coexist. Each answers a different aspect of the same condition. As the 20th century advances and the modern world accelerates further, the negotiation intensifies rather than resolves. New technologies promise constant engagement. Yet even amid abundance, moments of vacancy persist. The inheritance of earlier centuries whispers quietly, this too is part of being human. And so, in a final image, consider once more that narrow room overlooking a city alive with light. The glow beyond the window does not intrude. It pulses at a distance, steady and indifferent. The individual inside does not rush immediately toward diversion, though he knows it is available. He does not reach for spectacle or conversation out of reflex. Instead, he remains seated. He allows the clock to tick, each measured sound marking the passage of seconds that no longer feel accusatory. He breathes not to fill silence, but to accompany it. He reflects not in search of dramatic revelation, but in quiet acknowledgement of his own presence within the hour. Outside movement continues, carriages once trams, later footsteps always. Inside, awareness steadies no longer unsettled by the absence of distraction. The centuries of adaptation converge in this simple act, the decision to inhabit time rather than flee it. Boredom remains not as enemy alone, but as signal. It no longer carries solely the shadow of moral failure, nor only the sharp edge of modern dissatisfaction. It stands as a subtle indicator that attention seeks direction, that consciousness is alert to its own engagement. It invites choice without demanding panic. It asks quietly what shape this hour might take. And in that invitation lies the enduring legacy of how old England confronted the quiet weight of passing hours, not by silencing them entirely, not by drowning them in constant diversion, but by learning again and again how to remain within them, how to give them form, and how to live alongside them without fear. And now, as our journey through Old England slowly comes to rest, perhaps what lingers is not a specific law, or a particular village game, or even the sound of distant music halls rising in the 19th century. Perhaps what remains is something quieter, the realization that boredom has always been more than empty time. It has been a mirror, a test, a space where society decides what is acceptable, what is dangerous, and what it means to simply be still. For centuries, the people of England negotiated with time itself. They gathered in churchyards, in fields, in coffee houses, in crowded halls lit by gaslight. They told stories. They argued. They watched performances. They created rituals out of repetition. Not because they had nothing better to do, but because being human has always required connection. Even in silence, they were searching for rhythm. As you lie there now, perhaps in a room filled with soft electric light, perhaps in near darkness, consider this gently. When was the last time you allowed yourself to be bored without reaching for distraction? What did that quiet feel like? Uncomfortable, peaceful, heavy, or unexpectedly calm? If you enjoyed this slow walk through history, let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you. I truly enjoy reading your messages. They remind me that even in separate rooms, we are not alone. For now, let your thoughts soften. Let the noise of the day fade into the background. And as sleep begins to settle, remember across centuries, people have always searched for light within long, quiet hours. Good night.